Okay. There we go. Good morning. I would like to welcome everyone this morning to our little get-together. I am Mayor Scott Smith from Mesa, Arizona. I am the Vice President of the United States Conference of Mayors. To give you a little perspective, Mesa, Arizona is in the Phoenix metro area. We are the 38th largest city in the country with just under 500,000 inhabitants. Today we're going to be hearing from several people, my colleagues, who represent organizations that affect our individual citizens on a daily basis more than any other level of government. We're talking cities and towns and counties. And we're going to be talking about something that probably doesn't get people all excited because it's in many cases somewhat of a mundane issue, but is one that actually impacts people more than many of the things we're talking about with sequestration and any other fiscal cliff and all the other merry-go-round discussions you have here. This is about the real world, and this is about real impact and real effects on our citizens. Joining me this morning is from the National Association of Counties, and as usual in Washington, you're going to hear an alphabet soup. You'll hear the U.S. Conference of Mayors referred to as the USCM. NACO is the National Association of Counties President Chris Rogers, the Commissioner of Douglas County, Nebraska. Then we'll hear from the National League of Cities representative, or NLC representative, Houston City Controller Ronald Green. And then finally from NACO representative, the Government Finance Officers Association President-elect Timothy Firestein, Chief Administrative Officer of Montgomery County, Maryland. Let me start by talking about why this is an important issue and why the two or three organizations that we have deem it to be so important. Tax-exempt municipal bonds are the backbones of our economies and our ability to build the things that are important to every one of our citizens. Over the last decade, local and state governments have used tax-exempt municipal bonds, or muni bonds as they're commonly referred to finance almost $1.75 trillion. That's trillion with a T. Even that makes some difference here in Washington in investment in bridges, schools, hospitals, and other areas. This type of financing allows local and state governments to receive a lower interest rate because it's exempt from federal income taxes, and in many cases, state income taxes also. Now, this is a relationship that actually dates back to the imposition of the federal income tax in 1913. And from day one, it was perceived as somewhat almost unconscionable that the federal government would basically tax local citizens as they finance the building of their schools and bridges. Now, our relationship, because of our federal system, is different than it is in many countries. In many countries, the central government takes a much more active role in investment in local infrastructure. In the United States, we have school districts, cities, counties, states, special improvement districts who take the majority load. As a matter of fact, 75% of investment and financing done on streets, bridges, schools, and other things are financed at the local level using these very important tools of tax-exempt financing. The tax exemption saves local government, and when we say saves, it allows them to issue this financing at up to 2 percentage points, 200 basis points, lower than what they would if they were issuing corporate-grade bonds and paying federal income tax. During the last decade, as we've seen, we have used almost $1.7 trillion in tax-exempt bonds. The tax-exempt has allowed governments to build more things at a lower cost. And this is essential for us. These have been used for a variety of things. Over $500 billion for primary and secondary schools. Almost $300 billion for hospitals, water and sewer facilities, roads, highways, streets, public power projects, mass transit projects, the things that citizens rely on every day to conduct their lives. I like to tell elementary school students when I go speak to them, and they try to understand the concept of a local government. And I say, when you wake up in the morning, and in many cases when you flip that switch on, it's the local government's providing electricity. Not always, but many times. If not, it's a quasi-government, a municipal entity that does that. When you go to brush your teeth and you turn that faucet on, it's the local government. When you flush that toilet, when you take the garbage out, when you get in your car and get on the street, I mean, you go over every step of life that we go through that our local and county governments provide. Those impact people. Those were generally financed with tax-exempt municipal bonds. The current proposals that we have are based on, frankly, the need for Washington to generate revenue. As we talk about sequestration, we talk about things like balanced approach, as we talk about whether we're going to have tax cuts here, whether we're going to have revenue increases there, there's no doubt that Washington desires and wants more revenue. Many people in Washington do. And so what we have are a variety of proposals, but two primary ones that would affect it. The first one would be a 28% cap. Now, this is done in the idea that somehow tax-exempt financing benefits the rich. This is one of those loopholes that you hear about. And so the idea is if we cap it at 28% and therefore we deny all deductions beyond that, that somehow we'll be leveling the field. But what you've done is you've shifted that burden right on to everyday citizens. Because when local governments pay more for financing, two things happen. Number one, less gets built, or number two, our citizens pay more in taxes. And these are not rich people that are paying. These are the people that get up every morning, as I've said, and use our streets and our water systems and go to our schools. These are everyday, ordinary citizens. So it's a gigantic shift, a gigantic transfer from the federal government to the local and really to individual citizens, and from those who invest to everyday citizens. This would create a cost of $173 billion in additional costs. The second one, which came out first of all in the Simpson-Bowles Commission, was to completely eliminate this tax-exempt interest. Now, there's a lot of consequences that come with this that I don't think were totally thought through. The ones I've already mentioned, but also the fact that this would apply to existing debt. Now, there are trillions of dollars of existing debt sitting out there, and you can imagine how the markets will respond to that. It will very much have a huge negative impact on cities and counties and districts' ability to finance. In Mesa, for example, we have both what we call general obligation debt, and then we have debt specifically related to sewer lines and roads and electrical and things like that. Our total interest was over $50 million. With the 28% cap, we'd have to pay almost $8 million more in interest, which means we'd probably do $8 million less in work. If there were a full repeal, it would be well over $20 million in additional cost. Now, you can imagine we have our limits as to what we can do. And so it would be a combination of doing less. If we do less, it not only reduces the services that we can provide our citizens, but it does the one thing that everybody in Washington says they want to do. They want to create jobs. They want to create short-term jobs with construction projects. They want to create long-term economic prosperity. If we're building less, and these infrastructures are not operating, these are capital investments. You have fewer construction jobs. You have less economic opportunity. This is really really a twofer. But the twofer is not a good twofer. It's a bad twofer. It hurts us in multiple ways. The broad use of tax-exempt financing is, as I said, it touches every one of us, every one of you, and is widespread. This kind of action, while it appears that it solves Washington's problem, has a ripple effect that is beyond significance, beyond serious. And we're here to tell you that it will impact financially, quality of life-wise, public safety, everything. And it's just a bad solution. It's a very bad solution. So we're here to talk about exactly why this is bad. I've given you just a few examples. I'm going to now turn it over to NACO President Chris Rogers, who will talk to us about some of the impacts it has at the county level. President Rogers.
Thank you, Mayor. Again, my name is Chris Rogers. I'm the president of the National Association of Counties, and I also serve as a commissioner in Douglas County, Nebraska, where Omaha is the county seat. I want to thank you all for being here with this important issue and reiterate what the mayor said and emphasize the importance of tax municipal bonds, and just as important as the single most important mechanism to help us trigger and finance infrastructure. Any change to the taxation status of Often voter-approved debt issued by counties risks local public work projects that benefit communities and put into question the nature of the U.S. Federalist Partnership, a partnership that is well established and essential to provide for the evolving need of local communities and counties, which in turn serve in the national general interest. And then this partnership is supported by the tax exemption on municipal bond interest, which was included in the first written income tax code in 1913 and has allowed state and local governments to finance more than $1.65 trillion of infrastructure investment over the last decade. As many of you can see on the map that's presented, every state and by virtue nearly every community benefits from low-cost borrowing to fund critical infrastructure. That funding invests in schools, roads, water and sewers, airports and hospitals, just to name a few. Now, how this kind of ties together for me, particularly outside of the big words of infrastructure and a more local interest, is for the last 4 years, our community is dealing with the sewer separation project. And actually, for about the last 6 months, we've been working with the institutions up here to try to relieve some of the pressure mandated by the federal government to try to separate these sewer separation projects, which in my community is bringing polluted water into some people's homes. We're mandated to do this, and it costs $1.5 billion. In my community particularly, we're struggling to kind of finance this because of things what's going on with the economy and trying to ask the federal government to push it back. And us trying to deal with this to finance it, we've had to add an extra $50 a month talked about. Potentially how to finance this onto people's waters and sewer bills, because in Nebraska we don't have private, we have public water and utilities. So you take this issue where in regards to trying to invest in building hospitals in our county, trying to invest in building schools, if they take away this mechanism, where does that cost go? You know, it's going to have to be absorbed by passing that on to the taxpayer because, you know, to do the project, having to pay this interest is just going to be too much. So for us locally, this is going to go to the taxpayers. It's not about the person at the top of the chain. It's about the people at the lower part of the chain and how we're going to pick up this to pay for it. So maintaining the tax exemption prevents shifting new burdens to state and local governments because borrowing costs would increase, which hurts local taxpayers and can jeopardize whether local projects are completed. I thank you all for coming, and now I would like to turn it over to Controller Ronald Green.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Mayor. I want to just kind of follow up from a perspective of the city's elected CFO in the city of Houston. The one thing that people, I think, don't understand about municipal bonds is that these were authorized by voters. We went to the voters. It was the inducement for voters to get projects on the ground and get those on the ground as quickly as possible. And all these kind of add to the quality of life, I believe, that many people all across the country expect. In the city of Houston, we just recently had bond authorizations a vote in November, and the citizens overwhelmingly approved right at about $3 billion in the issuance of debt. And for those in bond speak, that's new money out there. Those are new projects that are out there. And for us, $144 million of that was for public safety, new fire stations, improvements to fire stations, improvements on the way we process at the jail. We also had about $166 million in park improvement bonds, connecting our bayous, connecting all of our parks that makes it that adds to the quality of life. When individuals move into neighborhoods, they want to make sure that they have good schools. They want to make sure they have good parks, and all of that spurs building in those neighborhoods. And so for us, what you see in the trickle-down effect is that you've got a horizontal growth of our tax base. So we think that's very important. If we stifle that growth, and especially major urban cores where people are deciding to move back in, we're making cities more walkable, more livable, we absolutely have to keep building infrastructure. In the city of Houston, we also had about $57 million in public improvement bonds, and that goes to that deals with our sanitation and recycling. We're all trying to do more with less. We're trying to take up less space in landfills. These public improvement bonds will help us to do a better job at recycling. I think that's important. Also, libraries. We all take for granted that many of us in this room can just look on our phones. We can go home. We all have computers. We all have internet access. But in certain areas, especially in areas of the city of Houston, many of our individuals don't have internet access. Basic things to make sure that kids can get reports done and get projects done. That's how we improve our libraries. Those are long-term projects that are important for our growth. And then finally, we've got affordable housing efforts in the city of Houston. And I think with municipal bonds that is the key way for us to spur that development. One of the things that I think is very important for people to know is that unlike maybe other entities, when we go out and we ask for authorization, we have very sophisticated debt models, and we make sure that we can pay these bonds back over the course of the life of the bonds. And if you add, in the case of the City of Houston, over the last 10 years, or on a yearly basis, if we add another $20 million to our debt service if the bond exemption was capped, or if it was totally gotten rid of, another $67 million. We pay our debt service with our tax receipts. That is basically general service obligation, and so that will mean layoffs. And it won't mean layoffs of people in the 39% tax bracket. Because that is the biggest misnomer out there. These are average, everyday people who work. They're your neighbors, they're my neighbors, and they've grown to expect to be able to get jobs from the issuance of municipal bonds. It's not just a tax exemption. It's not just a way to hide money. These trickle down to jobs on the street. They trickle down to the quality of life in neighborhoods. They trickle down to neighborhoods growing, and we just want to make sure that we fight and we put a face on this, because it's not just a nebulous number that is out there. It's actually the neighbor of yours and mine who works and who gets the actual benefit from this. And as Mayor Scott said, it would be a taxation on cities, because we would have to pass these costs on. We would have to raise our tax rates, and that was paid for by the average everyday citizen. So once again, we want to put a face on this. Whether there is a cap or whether there is a total elimination of the subsidies, we think that it is very important for us to fight, put a face on it, and make sure that individuals know that it is the average Joe who ends up ultimately paying the price for this. I'm sorry, Mr. Firestein. Mr. Firestein with the Government Finance Officers Association will now put the technical face on this for us.
Thank you, Mr. Green. So as introduced, I'm the Chief Administrative Officer or County Manager for Montgomery County, Maryland. Some of you might be residents of Montgomery County, so you're familiar with my jurisdiction. Montgomery County has about 1 million residents living in the county. We have about a $4 billion capital budget over the next 6 years. Most of what's in our capital budget is schools, transportation facilities, fire stations, police stations, water and sewer infrastructure. I'm also on the DC Water Board, which provides water and wastewater services to the District of Columbia and some of the surrounding jurisdictions. Their capital budget is also about a $2 billion capital budget, doing some similar things that Mr. Douglas had mentioned, or Mr. Rogers had mentioned, are going on in Douglas County. $2 billion of that is to replace to deal with the combined sewer overflow problem that the district has by building these massive tunnels, and also a nitrogen removal project of $2 billion to help restore the Chesapeake Bay. We've talked a lot about the fact that these are bonds which are very important to local governments. Just to give you some numbers, there are 50,000 state and local governments and issuing authorities that issue these types of bonds. And with that volume, you'll hear some people say that there are a lot of big governments that do this. Well, in 2012, there were 12,000 deals by smaller issuers around the country with an average size of about 28 million. So it shows the importance not just to large governments for their facility needs, but also to small governments. Also want to clarify something. Sometimes we hear that governments or local governments are spending too much and they're using these bonds to fill the gap. Not true. We don't use these bonds for operating expenses like the federal government does. Basically, these bonds are used for facilities. We don't use them to pay our electric bills and things like that. They're basically for facilities. Also, I want to mention and remind everybody that they're one of the safest investments. Some say treasuries are safer. I think if you ask Standard & Poor's right now, they have some local governments rated actually higher than the federal government, so maybe they are one of the safest, or they are the safest investment. Very few defaults occur in these bonds. There is a chart that is in the publication that shows what the impact would be on if there is a cap or if there is a repeal. I like to focus on the issue of the repeal because our concern is that a cap is a nose in the tent. It's an attempt to start down the path that we are concerned eventually the whole thing might go away. For Montgomery County, in the publication, it also shows that what happens is if you eliminate the exemption, clearly the exemption allows for us to borrow money at a reduced interest cost, mainly because the person who receives the benefit doesn't have to pay interest, pay taxes on that. And as it was said, that benefit is quite significant. Relative to a full repeal, there's about a 2% difference between taxable debt and tax-exempt debt. And how much is that? If you look at that decade that we've been referring to, that's about equivalent to $500 billion worth of stuff that could be done. So it's a $500 billion impact over those 10 years if these bonds had been taxed. And if you think about what $500 billion could provide, it provides a lot of things. In Montgomery County, our impact, just looking at what would our impact be, Montgomery County, if the exemption was repealed, the impact's about $40 million for Montgomery County each year. That's $40 million of stuff either we can't do in the operating budget because we have to pay more in debt service, or we have to reduce our capital program because we can't afford to do all the stuff that we're doing. If we have to cut the operating budget, you know, that's the equivalent of about 536 teachers in Montgomery County. So we have to cut 536 teachers. We have about 150,000 students in our school system. If you look at police officers, that's almost 300 police officers that we'd have to do without on the operating budget side. I want to come back to one thing where we said that this, you know, the concern is that it gets put out there that this is a benefit for the rich that would be taken away. And I think the case has been made about how it simply transfers that to a different taxpayer, those who cannot afford to pay, because most of the local governments are paying either through property tax or user charges, which are very regressive on the taxpayer. But a couple of other interesting numbers in terms of, you know, the debt itself. Who holds the debt? 57% of tax-exempt income is reported by earners over the age of 65. Now, those aren't our, you know, wealthy individuals out there. They are people who are trying to live off of their meager retirement income and possibly Social Security, and they invest a little bit in tax-exempt bonds. So the majority goes to those over the age of 65. Also, 52% of all bond interest is paid to individuals making incomes of less than $250,000. So the majority of this goes to lower income households. So if you repeal it, they get affected. Another fact is that, you know, why do people, if you look at who invests in these, with municipal bonds, 70% of the holders of municipal bonds are individuals, individual households, 70%. Compare that with U.S. Treasuries, only 12% are held by individual households, with the majority of treasuries being held by who? Foreign governments. So the people investing in their local facilities and infrastructure in this country happen to be those people who live here, or at least the majority of them, 70%. A couple of other facts. I think the point was made that, you know, right now we're looking at other cuts that are coming to state and local governments through the sequestration. If you look in the Washington region, major impacts resulting from furloughs that could take place that will affect our tax revenue. And just to layer this on top of it, has to have an impact on the services that we provide. And I'll conclude with one other point, a couple other points. One, we mentioned jobs. In Montgomery County, we have some master plans that could produce upwards of $15 to $17 million of additional economic growth in the 15 to 17 million square foot of additional space in the county that would create a lot more jobs. The problem is we need transportation facilities to service those areas that are growing. If you take away the tax exemption, it's going to impact what we can do. So again, it has a big impact on the jobs that can be created in the county. And finally, it was mentioned that the tax exemption has been in existence for 100 years, but you know, municipal bonds have really been around for 200 years. And the first municipal bonds were issued to build a canal in New York. But the income tax came into effect in 1913, and so that's why we say for 100 years they haven't been taxed. And if you think about that, municipal bond tax exemption has survived 2 world wars. It survived the Great Depression when the government was really strapped, but they still left municipal bond, the tax exemption alone. It also provided infrastructure and facilities for those folks returning from World War II who had to live someplace and in the new towns that sprung up across the country. And if you think about it, if our greatest generation could leave this alone and think about who holds those bonds today, people over 65, that's the generation who basically left the exemption in place. I think it's time for the federal government to leave it alone and respect those who took care of it in the past. Thank you. I'll turn it back to Mayor Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Firestein. So you have and have received a report that is issued by the three organizations, which gives summarizes what we've talked about and also gives details and more details as to entities and how they're used and the areas in which they're used. So I'd encourage you to look in this report and get the information you have. In summary, this report and what we're talking about is about something that's incredibly important, not only to city and towns and counties, but to individual citizens. For it is a tax not only on our local governments, but on our individual citizens. You hear a lot of talk in this town about fiscal cliffs, about sequestration, things like that. And, you know, the gentlemen on this table know what a fiscal cliff is. We don't deal in Washington speak fiscal cliffs where we lament the fact that the level of increase is going to be reduced a little bit. My guess is that nearly every city, town, and county has dealt with real dollar decreases over the last 4 years. And we've done it. We balanced our budgets. We learned how to do more with less, provide services. We've learned how to do this and still keep investing. This is about investments. We hear about how Washington likes to kick the can down the road. Well, they actually don't kick it down the road. What we find out is they kick the can into our arena. That's been during this recession, that's been what's happened, is that higher governments kick their problems onto lower governments and let us sort of fend for ourselves, fair avenue. And you know what? Cities, towns, counties have stepped up and have done it. That's why we're frustrated with Washington. We talk about, and Mr. Firestein talked about how this program has survived wars and the Great Depression. Our concern is that it will not survive the Great Dysfunction. And that's what we have here in Washington. The inability to come up with real solutions, and when we don't have real solutions, we look for easy ways out. This we perceive as an easy way out that really kicks a can onto individual citizens who can least afford it and on cities and counties who need to provide basic services. And this is about projects that are real investments that create jobs, jobs, jobs. Every way you look at this, this is bad policy. This is bad overall policy. It may be good for D.C., it's bad policy. This is about health. It's about public safety. It's about one of the safest investments in our country, as Mr. Firestein said. You'll see a headline when somebody defaults, but you have over 50,000 entities, and I would say that the default rate on municipal bonds is probably lower than any other type of. And the reason why, as Mr. Green said, there's a very well-established and mature and organized capital market mechanism that is in play here. Probably the most mature and disciplined in the entire country. This would upset that. So we just have one message. Don't mess with our bonds. Be careful what you ask for, because we believe that the ripple effect, the consequences are far greater than any benefit that can be derived. Just don't mess with them. Thank you. We'll now open it up to any questions you might have for any of us. Any questions? Yes, right here.
Specifically in the
mic, please.
Oh, Mike, there we go. That's right, it's being recorded, so if you use a microphone.
Specifically in Congress and in the federal government, where do you see the most serious threat to the tax exemption? Who do you feel is leading the fight against it?
We're the fortress, the four-sided fort that is being attacked on all sides. Unfortunately, when I talked about Washington looking for revenue, the debate before was in rates. Well, the compromise that we had on we need to start naming these fiscal crises like we do hurricanes, because I can't keep them separate anymore. I think the one back, and the big one, Congress came up and the administration came up with an agreement on rates, right? Well, you can only raise revenue two ways. You either affect the rates or you look at the base. You look at the sources. And what we're concerned with is now that there's been some grand deal on rates that seem to be frozen now in perpetuity with the extension of the Bush tax cuts in certain areas and the allowance on the upper income to go up, that Washington has to find revenue somewhere else. And there's been talk on both sides of the aisle and from the administration about closing loopholes. Our concern is that this has been lumped in with a loophole. The focus has been that somehow this is some great tax dodge, when in reality it is a great financing mechanism that, as has been said, is not a dodge unless you count all those fixed income seniors who invest heavily in this, all those ordinary citizens who derive benefits. So frankly, we're concerned that it's coming from all sides because it's the search for an easy solution to satisfy a demand for more revenue.
Yeah, I don't think it's a blame game at all. I mean, the fact is that you can have ideas. I mean, that no matter where it is, they're all decision makers. So we're just making our point that, okay, you put the idea up, but as decision makers, this is a bad choice to decide on.
I'll only add one thing to this. I think the biggest issue that we face is that many individuals in Congress don't understand where these bonds are being spent. And while we have sophisticated individuals who represent us, many of them are not at the lowest level of writing the checks, the proceeds from these bonds. And as I said before, the very same individuals who authorize these bonds are the same individuals that vote for these members of Congress and vote for us to be good stewards of this. And we really induced them into the authorizations by the models that we put out and what projects we think that we will be able to fund with these bond proceeds.
Okay, next question. Okay. Yes. Oh, microphone. There we go.
This idea of scaling back, or capping the 28% cap, or even repealing the tax-exempt status of muni bonds has been around for a while, and the prospects of tax reform happening, this month, next month, not good at all. So I'm wondering more on the why now.
I think we've all been. It not really has been why now for us, because we first it started with the BABS, the reduction in our BABS subsidies. So we've been talking about this, and I think that we want to make sure we bring it to the lowest common denominator. I think what we probably have not done, as I mentioned before, is to show people what these bond proceeds fund and how they affect the very person at the very bottom of the employment rung. So it has always been at the forefront for us. I think now that we are getting towards the deadline, and it's like anything else, people tend to pay a little bit more attention now. So,
with all the talk on sequestration, by the way, I was asking today, I was going to do a Spanish language interview, and I asked someone how you say sequestration in Spanish. And the Spanish word is secuestración, which interpreted means hostage. Okay. I thought that was very appropriate. It's now we've had this problem for a long time, but things have evolved. The discussion has moved, and so it's of utmost importance now. It's never too soon to be talking about this or too late. Next question.
Yeah, why is capping the tax exemption at 28% such a problem? It seems like everyone would get the same tax benefit. How do you know that would increase costs?
Well, first of all, we have a concern about a nose in the tent to begin with, because once you go to cap it, I think the concern is that, now we've done something we've never done before, and they'll go back to the well a second time. That's why we're really saying the true impact here that we're concerned about is repeal. If we go back to the point about BABS, when BABS were offered in 2008 in response to the recession as a way to help get infrastructure financing going, we said okay because the market had somewhat seized up and we thought it's an opportunity. But we learned our lesson, and the lesson was, while it sounded like a good idea to rely on the federal government to make those payments, was something we can't rely on. So we're arguing vehemently to preserve the tax exemption because we think it's the best way to provide the break to local governments.
And the other thing is, once again, the question, and I essentially what we're saying, is the problem we have with the discussion. The discussion is, at the federal level, somehow tax breaks to individuals. This is not a tax break. This is a shift. So whether you cap it at 28%, 25%, 30%, whatever it is, you put a cap in there, the costs will go up. The ability to finance will go down. The costs will shift from one taxpayer to another taxpayer, and that's from federal down. It will, that's mathematics.
Are you sure that's just conjecture? I mean, if theoretically you could attract a lot more investors if it wasn't just wealthy people who benefited from it.
Well, but as I said earlier, there, if you think about it, I mean, I know some people have put out there in the publication that, well, it's no big deal for a large issuer; they'll just go to the taxable market. They haven't been in the taxable market. We're not sure they have with Babs, but again, the subsidy payment was there. The question is, over the long term, what does it do to the rates? And I don't think there's any question that over the long term, you're going to see a huge rate differential between taxable and tax exempt, even for large issuers. But setting that aside, what do you do for those smaller issuers? The 12,000 issuers last year, with an average size of 20 million, will have no access to the taxable market and will pay more, and probably are those places that can ill afford to pay that additional cost.
And our concern is not really the ability to borrow if you're a large issuer. It's the cost, and it's the shift of that burden. It's the shift of the burden. And once again, if in Mesa, Arizona, I have to pay more to finance that police station, I'm either not going to pay that police station or I've got to recoup that cost from my individual members. And that's the greatest concern. It is this federal government shifting that burden and that responsibility to us. And then once again, you have a well-disciplined capital market, and there's no doubt that if you pay higher rates, you're going to attract more people. But once again, we could always pay higher rates, but that diminishes our ability to finance projects because, unlike the federal government, we have finite resources, and so it's the shift and the cost that concerns us. We're going to have to do less, or we're going to have to shift from the federal taxpayer down to the local taxpayer.
Take the context of what's going on now. I mean, it's taking away the immediate incentive right now to invest locally, which is going to create some jobs. I mean, you're trying to employ some people, like all the other projects that's noted. I mean, the federal government has some say in some highways and things of that sort, but we're funding a lot of other things there too. So, just playing with it at this point in time when you're trying to reemploy people and you're trying to get the economy back going, you're going to take some disincentive out. You're going to take some incentive out to try to build some things that employ a lot of people at the local level.
I'll only add this. If you look at it from the most utilitarian perspective, the benefit derived from a lower level construction worker far outweighs the tax benefits that someone in the 39% tax bracket gets from this, because these bonds represent jobs and it's least common denominator.
Yeah, is that the point that I can point specifically is that if the county and the city at our level, some of these projects for schools and things of that sort, you have minority women-owned businesses that we have programs with. And when you get down to that lower level, you're employing some of the most poverty-ridden communities around with jobs for their mothers, for their fathers. You're talking food on the table. There's people that's sitting around that can't get work now because uncertainty in the economy. You take stuff like this out, and it's going to start hitting targeted areas even more.
Next question. A couple more questions. One over here.
Hi, just getting back to one of your guys' comments earlier. You have been talking about this for quite some time, yet the idea of creating an exemption or eliminating the tax-free nature altogether keeps coming up. So wanted to know how you felt about your progress on this message so far, that this message that this isn't about rich people, that this is about infrastructure and that kind of thing, and maybe what new tactics you might be coming up with in the coming months.
I know for me, especially in a city the size of Houston, even if I talk about the exemptions on municipal bonds, I'm so glad to see more than 3 people here in the room. So that's a start. That's the first thing. But secondly, I think we have to get out in front. And as I said before, I don't believe we have made it tangible to individuals. As I said before, people, you hear about the cap, you hear about the exemption, you hear about 39% tax rate, you hear about 28%. All of that means nothing unless you drive it down to who benefits from this. And as I said before, while you may have people in upper level tax brackets who invest in these bonds, the people who actually get the jobs from that are those people who live on the streets of all the 19,000 cities we represent.
I think we are also making some progress. I think we're hopeful. The Department of Transportation seems to understand this issue and is I think, going to work to help us get our message out. I know there's been a lot of meetings with representatives and on the Hill, some who get it and understand the impact of it. So I think we're making a little bit of progress. We just have to get out more.
And like anything in D.C., you can talk as long as you want, but it seems like until there's a crisis, people don't really listen. And we see ourselves getting, it's a process of elimination, as I said. We had this fiscal cliff and that crisis, now sequestration. So we're sort of eliminating options, and we see this as one of the options that's sitting in there still on the table that hasn't been eliminated. And so we need to get out and talk, and people are more willing to listen now, because I think they talked about it, but no one took it seriously. Now I think we're taking it very seriously, that this is being discussed as a potential option, and we need to let people know, okay, that's fine. What does it really mean? And that's the education process and the information process we're talking about. So I know there's a change in tactic as much as there is a new sense of urgency, because things tend to happen in a sort of a different order here than they do in real life.
One thing that I think that the tactic I've changed in the city of Houston is to really educate my elected officials. While I'm the CFO of the city, I'm an elected CFO, but I've previously served as a city council member. So obviously, as you're going out and you're worried about neighborhoods, you're promising new fire stations, police stations, new roads, new parks, everything. But if you don't know how that's financed, and then really the technicalities of how it's financed, I think that's caused a lot of our elected officials to now start saying, I may need to pay attention to this, and I need to assist those of us who are a little bit more sophisticated in finance, and let me help them. So as a result, many of our elected officials are now coming on the Hill and talking to our delegations and talking to the public about, well, we need your help too, because that park I promised you, you may get that, but it may be 10 years down the road.
Listen, unless there's another question, thank you very much for being here. Thank you for taking an interest in a very important issue. We appreciate it. Thank you. Well done. Thank you.